Built on pottery, the architectural reuse of discarded ceramics in Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire, by Alex Chong, Emma Treleaven, and Alistair Brooks. Situated along the Trent and Mersey Canal in Burslem, Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire, Middleport Pottery is a still operational Victorian pottery factory where the Burgess and Lee Company, or Burley, still produces traditional transfer printed pottery. The business began when Frederick Rathbone Burgess and William Lee formed a partnership in 1851. They then moved to Middleport Pottery in 1889, having previously worked from other Staffordshire pottery sites. Burgess and Lee built Middleport on a site formerly owned by the Davenport pottery firm, and merged their names to become the famous Burley brand. When it was first built, Middleport Pottery was described as the model pottery of the Staffordshire pottery industry, because its site layout and architectural design was intended to maximise production efficiency. This was achieved by minimising the distance travelled between each stage of the production process, with clay arriving via the Trent and Mersey Canal at the south end of the site, and then production taking place in stages counterclockwise across the site, with finished wares then packed onto boats in the canal to be shipped and sold. Middleport also contained a bathhouse and other facilities, allowing for a greater factory floor attention to hygiene and cleanliness. Earlier factories, like Wedgwood's famous Etruria works, had often developed haphazardly after initial construction, so the rationalisation of production represented by Middleport Pottery was an important development in the history of the Staffordshire ceramics industry. From 1912, ownership of the business was held solely by the Lee family following the death of Frederick Burgess's son Richard. Over time, Burley expanded to export wares all over the globe, setting up agency offices in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. Middleport Pottery survived both World Wars and has employed a number of eminent designers, including Charlotte Reed. Today, following a brief ownership in the late 1990s to early 2000s by William and Rosemary Dorling, the company is owned by Denby Holdings Limited. However, ownership of the site of the factory now rests with Reform Heritage. In 2011, the site was acquired by the Prince's Regeneration Trust, which launched a multi-million-pound restoration of the Grade 2-star listed site. It is now owned and operated by Reform Heritage, which was previously the property-owning wing of the trust, but which is now an independent charity. Approximately half the site is leased back to Burley, which continues to produce pottery using traditional 19th century methods, and the rest of the site remains a visitable heritage attraction. Middleport is the last continuously operating Victorian pottery factory in Stoke, and Burley is the last company to still use traditional transfer printing to decorate ceramics. Adjacent to Middleport Pottery is a row of 11 terraced houses on Harper Street. Reform Heritage has been restoring these as part of the £2.6 million Harper Street Engagement in Heritage project, which is nearing completion, and indeed the site will open to the public during the SPMA conference. This project has involved transforming these original workers' houses into a new heritage attraction which interprets everyday life in Stoke in the 1950s, has studio and workshop space, a publicly accessible collection store and research room for the Burley Archive, and a community centre for local resident group Middleport Matters. The project has been made possible due to the generous support of the National Lottery Heritage Fund, Historic England, Architectural Heritage Fund, Stoke-on-Trent Council, and other funders. Harper Street was originally known as Albion Street and was renamed in the 1950s. An 1870s map shows that Albion Street itself predates Middleport Pottery, but the 11 still standing houses on Harper Street are visible on a later Ordnance Survey map from the 1890s, suggesting that these structures were built at around the same time as the factory itself. The later 19th century proliferation of housing was typical of Stoke-on-Trent and was directly linked to the expansion of the pottery industry. Census data and other evidence shows that the 11 two-up, two-down terraced houses on Harper Street would have housed pottery workers and their families. For example, Thomas Edge, the lodgeman for Middleport Pottery, lived in number 113 at the end of the terrace. Records suggest that Thomas Edge and his family lived in the lodgekeeper's house from the 1910s through 1930s. This part of Harper Street, along with the two adjacent houses, will form part of the new How We Lived at Harper Street heritage interpretation, which uses oral histories, audio-visual interpretation, and original objects donated by local community members to interpret everyday life for working-class pottery families in Stoke in the 1950s. Now, the restoration of Harper Street was not designed as an archaeology project. Alex and Emma, the two lead authors of this paper, are museum and archive collection specialists rather than archaeologists. Nonetheless, there are aspects of the regeneration project which are likely of interest to post-medieval archaeologists, particularly those of an interest in ceramics and domestic buildings, and it was with my encouragement that we're sharing these here at the SPMA conference. The redevelopment of Harper Street involved extensive building restoration work. The houses were inexpensively built 19th century dwellings where the internal structural walls were often just a single course of bricks thick. They had been derelict for decades prior to regeneration. Both of these factors led to significant structural issues. One former resident, when interviewed about their time living in one of the houses, expressed surprise that reform would be able to restore the buildings at all. She joked that the wallpaper was the only thing holding the walls up. This, alarmingly, turned out to almost be true. Years of subsidence required the building contractors to dig under the buildings to reinforce their foundations. During this process, the contractors discovered that the houses had been built on piles of broken pottery, a resource in plentiful supply in Stoke-on-Trent, of course. While we are unable to quantify the amounts across the site, there was a wide range of biscuit and glazed, undecorated, refined white-bodied earthenware, along with some decorated pieces, some pieces showing firing defects, and the odd piece of kiln furniture. Most pieces were quite simple in form, but there was also an elaborate slip-cast teacup and some jug handles. 3 of the glazed pieces that were recovered from the foundations feature partial or complete maker's marks. It was initially assumed that the broken bits of industrial pottery came from Middleport Pottery as it was across the street, but this has been proven not to be the case. From the back stamps, we know that some of the fragments came from John Maddock and Sons, a firm whose earthenware factory was located on Newcastle Street in central Burslem, about 800 metres from Middleport Pottery and Harper Street. John Maddock started his pottery in Newcastle Street in the 1830s, and it was a flourishing independent business by the 1850s. The Maddock family, like the founders of Middleport Pottery, were known locally for their keen social conscience. John Maddock Sr. was a member of the Burslem Board of Health between 1850 to 1868, and at one time offered to build public baths for local residents at his own expense. The impact of the Maddock family and their business can be seen in the fact there is still a road named after them almost directly adjacent to Harper Street. John Maddock and Sons operated into the 1960s and used a variety of back stamps in its long history. The marked pieces found under the Harper Street houses date no earlier than 1906, which calls into question what we know about the terrace. Based on map data, the houses were built no later than the 1890s. As the pottery fragments were found in the foundations at the back of the houses, it's possible they were part of some later attempt to fix the inexpensive and poorly built foundations. It's also possible the current Harper Street houses are not the ones that appear on the 1890s Ordnance Survey map, but were built in the early 20th century to replace earlier homes. Resolving this issue will require further research. Another architectural surprise was uncovered when the building was being stripped back for structural repairs, and broken pieces of pottery were uncovered cemented into a windowsill at one end of the terrace. While it is by no means unheard of for buildings to be built on top of old refuse tips, finding pieces of broken pottery embedded into the building was unexpected. As the mortar holding the pieces in place was a different colour to the surrounding mortar, the ceramics appear to have been added post-construction. Knowing the low quality of workmanship at the terrace and the unstable nature of its foundations, it is reasonable to suggest that some cracks in the bricks and mortar must have appeared over time. These fragments were likely added as a quick fix to the problem, whether by a professional or an amateur, using materials that would have been both readily available and free in early 20th century Stoke. None of the pieces recovered from the windowsill have maker's marks, so it remains unknown whether they are related to the ceramics that underpin the buildings, or if they came from Middleport Pottery across the road, or, like at least some of the ceramics used in the foundations, came from another nearby pottery. As the terrace was not structurally sound when the discoveries were made, health and safety concerns meant that Reform Heritage staff only had very limited access to the ceramics underpinning the building and in the repaired windowsill. Staff took action to select representative pieces to become part of the Middleport Pottery collections before the areas were once again covered, also taking photographs of the items in situ. The recovered items are now held in the Middleport Pottery Archive, which has itself recently relocated to Harper Street. Further localized reuse of ceramics was identified during the excavation of a Harper Street-related utilities trench across the street, directly outside Middleport Pottery itself. None of these were datable, but from context they were used to partially fill a late 19th or early 20th century utilities trench following the same line as the new 21st century trench. The original trench had been partially refilled with soil, which had then been overlaid with layers of ceramics, primarily biscuitware and kiln furniture, and ash, which in turn had been sealed by a layer of bricks. While the archaeologist undertaking the watching brief for the new trench decided that the original features and ceramics were not archaeologically significant, and none of the ceramics were marked, Reform staff were again able to save a sample for the Middleport collections. That discarded broken ceramics were exceptionally common in late 19th and early 20th century Stoke is perhaps not a surprise. This is the city, after all, that was at the centre of the British ceramics industry from the 18th through 20th centuries. Many major construction projects in the city cut through or otherwise disturb the old dumps and tips of the 19th and 20th century industry. This was recently emphasised in the immediate vicinity, when a redevelopment project on the opposite side of the Trent and Mersey Canal from Middleport Pottery involved bulldozing several old ceramics dumps, including the site of the former Burley tip, which is no longer owned by either Burley or Reform Heritage. So widespread are the remains of the industry at its peak that they rarely receive detailed archaeological investigation prior to redevelopment. So uncovering ceramics in the course of construction projects in Stoke is not only not that unusual, but is usually anticipated to some degree. That discarded ceramics were readily used both as structural supports and as backfill in working class districts of Stoke is, however, much less well documented, at least on a formal level. Ongoing oral history work suggests that the practice may have been reasonably widespread. This emphasises not just how ubiquitous these materials were in the city, but also how discarded pottery was creatively reused by both working class families and local builders in domestic architecture and while making adjacent utilities provision. Perhaps in future another opportunity will arise to examine the ceramics underpinning Harper Street, but for now we can conclusively say that Stoke-on-Trent is built on pottery, both figuratively and literally. And for more information on Middleport Pottery and Harper Street, please visit the Reform Heritage website shown here. Thank you very much for your time.